From the studios of Media Training Worldwide in New York, this is Inside Communications, and I'm your host, Mike Bako. The world's economy has certainly been struggling over the last few years, so now it's more important than ever to know exactly what your customers want. Today on Inside Communications, we go inside the winning strategy study with DCI's Andy Levine. Coming up next on Inside Communications. Andy, thanks for joining us today on Inside Communications.
Thank you for the invite.
So before we jump into the winning strategy study, let's take an overview of the industry as a whole. What are some of the challenges when you're trying to promote an actual destination in a place as opposed to, say, a consumer product?
Yeah, they're quite different. You know, a consumer product, you have control over every element of the product. A place is much more multifaceted. There are hundreds of different elements to it, and it's more challenging for a convention visitors bureau or an economic development group to try to control that. So it's much more out of your control in that regard.
Okay, so what's in your control as someone who is going to market that place? Do you go to the place? Do you get entrenched in the place? What are some of the steps that you take to get familiar with the place, to actually find a great strategy to move forward?
Yeah, no, what we try to do is look at the overall product and pick out the elements that we think are the most marketable, the most interesting elements of it. So in the case of a tourism destination, you find the attractions that are the most attractive, frankly. In the case of a business product, you're looking at what companies are here that really are either well-known or doing incredibly innovative things. So you look at the overall piece of the puzzle and try to pick out the most interesting elements of it.
And let's take a look at some of the interesting elements and some of the puzzle pieces in this survey. Mm-hmm. So let's not go back to the past 6 versions of this. You've done it every 3 years?
Every 3 years since 96.
Every 3 years. So the world has certainly changed since 96. Let's just go back to 2008. Mm-hmm. What are some of the changes that you've seen? Where every time I turn on the news, it's about jobs, jobs, jobs. What's this survey saying about jobs?
Well, you know, it's interesting. One of the things we do in this survey is we look at what are the best states in terms of perception. You know, what are the strongest states that the business community, that corporate America thinks about. Interestingly enough, there hasn't been a lot of change there. Texas has been #1 for the last 4 times we've done this survey. North Carolina has done very well. South Carolina has done very well. Tennessee, Georgia as well. So, you know, those states obviously seem to be more focused in the South, and they, you know, continually do well in our survey.
And the big East Coast and West Coast states, New York and California, perennially not so good. What's the perception of New York and California?
Yeah, California we have seen slide rather dramatically in the survey over the years. It is seen as a very unfriendly business climate, seen as having high taxes, seen as having a lot of red tape. For New York, sort of similarly that, add to that also overall operating costs being high. We did see a change in Illinois being negatively impacted, and that really was a function of a change in their tax code where their corporate taxes went up very dramatically in the last year.
Let's take a look inside this study now in terms of perception. When you did this survey of C-level executives and people that are going to these places, what did you find in terms of what was most marketable to them? When they wanted to go to a certain place, what did they rely on? What did the study tell you?
Sure. We asked specifically what are the information sources that help to shape your view of a business climate. #1, and has been since we started the survey in '96, is dialogue with industry peers. So what my colleagues are telling me from other companies from within my industry, that's #1. Articles in newspapers and magazines was #2, and this year for the first time rankings and surveys came in at #3. So 2 of those are very much tied to the media.
Now, one thing that's missing there is social media, which I found very, very interesting, going inside the numbers even more, that a certain age bracket, 40 to 49, uses social media more than their younger counterparts and their older counterparts. What did you find about that demographic? Why do they use social media more than the others?
This was an absolutely fascinating finding, Mike. What our conventional wisdom told us was that the younger the executive was, the more interested and more attuned to social media they would be. The survey didn't bear that out at all. Once again, the 40 to 49 demographic seemed to do much better than their older executives, but also younger executives. So why? It's been put forward, and I think it's a good theory, that the 40 to 49 demographic are dealing with high school age kids or college age kids that are probably using social media at a greater rate, and so they're exposed to it through their children. So that's just a guess, but I think it's a pretty good guess.
So what can a state do to use some of these social media tools? In the study, again, we're going inside the numbers.
Yeah.
Executives like to use LinkedIn, they don't really like to use Facebook, and they're not really using YouTube. From everything that I've heard, YouTube is just a great way to reach out, to produce your own content.
Yep.
Not to have it be overly produced, but to actually get someone on the ground to show the flavor of a city, to show the flavor of a state, a convention center. Why are states not using social media more?
Well, in terms of reaching corporate executives with site selection responsibilities, when we ask the question, do you use social media for business, 38% said, I do not use social media at all. 58% said LinkedIn, and a much smaller percentage said Facebook, Twitter, blogs, and that sort of thing. So to me, the takeaway is LinkedIn is really the opportunity. If you want to reach these executives, reaching them through LinkedIn groups that they're participating in, connecting with them individually on LinkedIn, that seems to be the real kind of takeaway from the study, that LinkedIn is kind of the gold standard in terms of reaching this group.
What can a state do once they actually have someone there? If a lot of this is predicated on word of mouth and making the experience as pleasurable as possible, what can states do, what can convention hosting cities do to make it more pleasurable for people that are actually showing up there?
Well, certainly, the most important thing is if you know an executive that you're trying to reach and trying to influence is coming to your city to make it as pleasurable experiences as possible, simply to reach out and to say, we'd like to connect with you. If there's an opportunity to sit down face to face with you, speak about our business climate, what we might be able to do for your company, that's probably the best technique of all. Also, if there are peers, people they might be connected to in business who could be an introduction for you, that's another good technique to use.
Let's take a look at some of the media that some of these executives consume. We're talking about the Wall Street Journal, very, very popular, up over 80% of your respondents do either the online version or the print version. What are some of the other media outlets that they frequent?
Number one was the Wall Street Journal, and it was just overwhelming. 82% said this is one of the top business publications that I read. It was followed by sort of their local paper. So if you're in Cincinnati, it's the Cincinnati Enquirer. If you're in San Francisco, it's the San Francisco paper. Below that was Forbes, The Economist, Business Week as well. So it tended to be kind of the large, top-tier general business publications that they're reaching and viewing.
Let's go back to the beginning of the survey. We touched on that this is now the 6th incarnation of it. What are some of the huge changes that we've seen since that first survey in 1996? Yeah. We mentioned that over and over again we see states like Texas and North Carolina and South Carolina leading the pack in terms of being business friendly, but what are some of the other changes that we've seen since the first survey?
The most enormous change has been in the power of the internet in influencing the perceptions of executives. We talked a little about social media, and top-tier executives have not been turned on to social media the way 20-somethings and 30-somethings have been turned on to, but they have been turned on to the internet as a source of information about the business climates of states. That has risen up to, in '96, it wasn't even included in the survey, to now where it is really the second most important way of influencing executives.
How are you hoping that states use this survey? Are they going to look at it and say, okay, we're not reaching people via social media? Or do they look at it and say, okay, you know what, they're not going to social media? Is it that yin and yang of, well, if they're not doing one thing, we're not going to do it? Or do they look at it and say, hey, you know what, they're not looking at this, but let's make them look at it. Let's do some great YouTube content. Let's make a Facebook page. Let's interact with these people.
You know, different economic developers or government leaders are going to look at this survey differently. I do think it provides a roadmap for what is working in terms of reaching executives. You certainly can make an impact as being an outlier just because you know, tactic A is working for the majority of the industry. You can be a successful outlier by using tactic Z in a creative way. So I think it sort of tells you what's working now, but it doesn't necessarily project, you know, what's going to work 2 years from now or even right around the corner.
Let's take a look at some of the things that have worked specifically for you at DCI. You started your career there about 2 decades ago in 1991, and you've had some great success stories. Certainly an enviable task of having a Sports Illustrated swimsuit shoot held. You were able to pull that together for South Africa. Tell us a little bit about that. How were you able to bring such a prominent publication there, certainly getting a great spread in the magazine, but what were some of the steps that you had to take to bring them there?
You know, it's a pretty short story. I was sitting in a cab with our client, and we were talking about a photo shoot that was going to take place in South Africa. And this gentleman just leans over to me and said, how could we get the swimsuit issue to be filmed there? And I said, I don't know. Let me go back to the office and I'll make a call. I called up Julie Campbell, who is the longtime editor of that particular shoot. And she said, South Africa, that would be interesting. Can you come in tomorrow? And so literally we got, you know, back in a cab the next day, went over there the next day and talked to her about it. I didn't know there was a private agenda going on there. For 25 years that she had been running the publication, or running that element of the publication, she had always wanted to put an African-American model on the cover. She saw South Africa as the opportunity to do it for the first time, and she succeeded in it.
And that was that famous front cover with Tyra Banks, if I recall
That's correct.
correctly. What are some of the long-term impact that can be associated with that? Can you trace, going back now, that was about a decade or so ago, but then other clients that you've worked with, New Orleans just recently, in terms of getting well over $5.5 million worth of advertising and marketing through different media coverage, tens of thousands of hits. How do you keep that going? Once the media has done coverage to a certain place like South Africa or New Orleans, how do you keep that ball rolling?
Well, it certainly helps, you know, a large, what we would call a signature placement, like, you know, a major article in Fortune on the business side, or Forbes or Business Week, or something like the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue. That draws attention to someone like South Africa, and you can sort of, it's sort of like a snowball rolling down a hill, and you just try to look for other avenues, other ways to keep the story fresh. You know, other reporters, other individuals, other publications, or broadcast outlets that would cover it. So it's sort of building upon the early success of a signature placement.
Certainly this study has been quite successful. How far in advance do you start planning the next one? We're talking about every 3 years. What's the internal process like in terms of coming up with survey questions, focusing on people to try to respond to the specific survey, just seeing what some of the trends are? How far of a lead time do you have for the next study?
We really start about a year in advance of when we want to present it. This year we did something interesting. We surveyed about 100 people within place marketing. We sort of said, you know, here's the survey we did in 2008. What should we change in 2011? And they came back with some really, really good suggestions that made for a very different survey in 2011, and I think a much, much better product.
So you're doing a survey to help you do the survey.
That's exactly right. Yep.
Let's, again, wrapping up, what's the profile of these executives? We mentioned that 325 or so responded. How does that rank in terms of past people that have responded, the number of people? Can you get an accurate measurement from that number of people?
This was the largest response we've seen in the 6 years, or the 6 times that we've done the survey, so it was a good sample size. It's all executives with companies with revenues of over $25 million. It's all in the C-suite, either CFO, CEO, sometimes a senior vice president in very, very large companies like a Microsoft. But it's really the C-suite that we're talking about, and it's the decision maker that we're speaking with.
Okay, and I'm sure that a lot of states are going to be looking at this to help improve some of their rankings to try to get into that category of Texas and South Carolina and North Carolina. Andy, thanks for taking us inside your study.
Thanks so much, Mike.